My name is Michael Preston Shute, and I am now an independent adult safeguarding consultant. I chair 3 safeguarding adult boards, am the joint convener of the National Network for SAB Chairs. I write safeguarding adult reviews, and I have researched a number of areas of adult safeguarding, most particularly self-neglect. And that's the subject of this particular presentation. We have a statutory definition of self-neglect. It's contained in the statutory guidance that accompanies the 2014 Care Act and is derived from research. So we're talking about people who significantly neglect their own care. They may also neglect their own environment, particularly living in a context of hoarding. And very often they refuse care and support and healthcare interventions. Research has actually asked people who have experience of self-neglect what has been most helpful for them, and in contrast, what has got in the way of best practice with them. And this particular slide captures in summary form what they have said. And you can conduct your own appreciative inquiry, your own temperature check of where you think your own practice and the practice that you are aware of gets close to, if you like, the standards that they set about what is most likely to be helpful to them. So they talked about engagement, and particularly services not setting barriers to engagement by creating expectations about how service users will engage with them, but actually reflecting on whether in fact it is services who are not engaging with service users rather than the other way around. The importance of concerned curiosity, asking and inquiring into the backstory, how a person comes to be the person that you encounter today. Partnership working, including actually inviting people to multi-agency risk management meetings, complex case panels, case conferences, inviting the person themselves to contribute to those meetings. And basically approaching this in a person-centered way, recognizing the importance of relationship building, establishing trust, maintaining continuity with individuals, and being respectful about the language that we use. For example, in a context where we might consider that a person is hoarding, recognizing that actually the contents of what we might regard as hoarding have enormous emotional significance for the individuals themselves. Roughly 45% of all safeguarding adult reviews focus on self-neglect. It is the most frequently reviewed type of abuse or neglect. And common features of the findings of safeguarding adult reviews in Walsall and indeed elsewhere is contained on this slide. A failure to explore and understand what self-neglect might mean for the individual themselves. We're back again to the lack of concerned curiosity. Assessments which are partial, not thorough, omitted completely sometimes. Assessments which rely on what an individual says, rather than also exploring whether they have executive functioning, whether they actually have the capacity to act. Making assumptions about lifestyle choice, and not using the provisions in law, particularly Section 42 of the Care Act, the duty to inquire. These are common shortcomings found routinely in safeguarding adult reviews. How many of those perhaps do you recognise from your own practice or from the practice that you are aware of. But we can turn those shortcomings actually into an evidence base for best practice. And that evidence base for best practice has 4 particular domains or layers. And again, I would invite you to do a temperature check or an appreciative inquiry. How close in your own practice and how close in practice that you are aware of do services get to the different components of the evidence base? So here you can see 9 components that should characterize our work directly with individuals who self-neglect. Is that work person-centered, relationship-based, establishing trust, even where that takes time? Are we understanding the person's history, the backstory, through concerned curiosity? How thorough are the assessments that we do, for example, of risk or of mental capacity? Do we fully understand the impact of trauma and adverse experiences that actually might help to explain the backstory of self-neglect? And when people are approaching significant transitions, whether those individuals are care experienced young people or people approaching discharge from hospital, for example, are we attempting to provide wraparound health, housing and social care? And finally, are we thinking family? Is there a circle of support available to this individual if only we were to inquire about it, from family members, from neighbours, from friends, from social contacts? We have an evidence base about direct practice. How close do we get? And many of the SARs tell human stories that identify why these components of direct practice are so important. So on this slide relating to Eric, the finding was about curiosity. Those involved in this particular case missed opportunities with Eric and particularly with his wife and his daughter to try to understand the backstory, the different transitions that Eric had gone through that might help to explain his particular self-neglect. There were shortcomings too in not exploring the different legal options that might have been available, including, in this case, the Court of Protection. And practitioners involved did not take the time to ensure that those providing care, particularly his wife and his daughter, understood the support that they could receive as carers from the local authority and from other services. And perhaps we overlooked the fact that Eric, yes, had a right to private and family life, but he also had a right to life. And we needed to balance those different human rights in determining how to intervene in his particular case. The human story of Duncan, very different, a younger person with significant forms of mental distress, where actually we needed to ensure that safeguarding was personal. Duncan was very clear what he wanted at the end of a long stay in a psychiatric unit and then being discharged into a homeless hostel for homeless people. He was very clear what safeguarding would look like for him, but that didn't feature in how services responded. And there were findings here about the inadequacy of risk assessments in his particular case, which underscore the importance of thorough risk assessments in situations of self-neglect. And we have to ask ourselves, I think, why concerned curiosity is so difficult. People who self-neglect have given clues about what matters to them if they are to open up to our concerned curiosity. We have to establish relationships that service users will recognise as careful in the hyphenated sense of that word. In other words, full of care. We have to explore what might not be so obvious, but equally, we have to pay attention to what is obvious. For example, in relation to people who live in conditions of hoarding, but who also smoke, there are clearly questions to be asked about how they will keep themselves safe from the risk of fire death in such a situation. There may be occasions when you have experienced enormous anxiety or difficulty in asking questions that, in a sense, reflect concerned curiosity. I have certainly been there myself and found it very difficult to ask particular questions at a particular point in time. So I've put here some hypotheses, if you like, some reasons why sometimes we might all experience concerned curiosity to be difficult. If that is the case, who supports you? Who looks after you? Who can you rely on to help you prepare for what you anticipate to be difficult conversations? And who can you talk about the outcome of those conversations once you have had them? And in relation to capacity assessments, one of those assessments that have to be thorough and routine and reviewed, a particular feature of mental capacity assessments is the importance of assessing executive functioning, not just relying on what a person does, but actually, particularly in a context of repetitive patterns, actually exploring whether an individual has the capacity to act. There's available guidance on executive functioning. That guidance comes from NICE, but it also comes from court of protection judgments that have advised us to conduct real-world observations, exploring what an individual can or cannot do, rather than simply what an individual says they might do. And a social worker called Ellie Atkins, who works in Manchester with people experiencing homelessness and substance misuse, has developed a really useful resource on YouTube on executive functioning, identifying why assessing a person's capacity to act is so important. It revolves around the frontal lobe of the brain, and the frontal lobe of the brain can be disabled by a variety of experiences, as you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, that begins with acquired brain injury. And the impact of those disabilities is listed on the left-hand side of the slide. Key executive functioning skills, which we might all take for granted, that actually might be more difficult for an individual to demonstrate when, for example, they have experienced trauma, adverse experiences, and dependence on alcohol or other drugs. We need to find a way of including executive functioning in our capacity assessments. And 4 safeguarding adult reviews I have highlighted here that highlight again the importance of including executive functioning in capacity assessments. And if that is the domain about direct practice, here is the second domain, 9 components in this domain of what I might call the team around the person. We need a bespoke team around the person, bespoke in the sense that we bring in practitioners and services that have a contribution to make to the diverse needs that an individual presents: health, housing, social care, environmental health, fire and rescue, and so on. We need services to work together rather than to bounce referrals one to another. We need information sharing, recognising that for an adult at risk, the law does not prohibit the sharing of information in order to safeguard them. We need a much more extensive use of multi-agency meetings, whatever you call them in Walsall and elsewhere. And within a context of a multi-agency approach, we need everyone to be clear what their individual roles and responsibilities are, and in particular cases, to nominate a lead agency and a key worker to coordinate the collaboration between different services. We need to ensure that we are using Section 42 of the Care Act when appropriate, when the three criteria: a person has care and support needs, is experiencing or at risk of abuse or neglect, and is unable to protect themselves. We need to ensure that we are inquiring into those particular cases and then recording and sharing the recording of the work that is going on in a particular case. And again, human stories illustrate different aspects of this evidence base. One here from the City of London and Hackney, illustrating the importance of multi-agency and multidisciplinary risk management meetings, and the importance of referring adult safeguarding concerns to the local authority and escalating concerns if the local authority does not respond, in your view, appropriately to what you regard as an appropriate adult safeguarding concern referral. And another case, this time involving Kirklees, someone who was experiencing homelessness and alcohol dependence as well as self-neglect, again illustrating the importance of using Section 42 of the Care Act and its adult safeguarding provisions, and using multi-agency meetings in order to share information and to attempt to construct plans that will mitigate the risk and meet a person's health, housing and care and support needs. And the third of the four domains is the organisational environment. I can capture this in one question to you: who looks after you? Who prepares you for this complex, challenging and difficult area of work? Are you in receipt of supervision? Are you using supervision to prepare you for encounters with individuals who are self-neglecting and to debrief the outcome of the work that you have attempted to do? Do you feel that you have the knowledge and the skills in order to engage people who are self-neglecting? And do you feel that you are working in a context where you have single and multi-agency procedures, policies and protocols that give you a framework within which to act? And if you feel that there is a gap in resources, are you enabled to have conversations with commissioners in the ICB and in the local authority that might actually be able over time to remedy some of the gaps in provision that you identify through your work? And again, some of the human stories that I've shared, and some new ones indeed, highlight the importance of conversations between commissioners and providers, the importance of having policies and procedures and protocols that provide you with a framework within which to act, and crucially, the importance of supervision and staff support. So when I ask the question, who looks after you, you can give a positive response. And the reason why it is really important that you feel looked after is because in many of the cases that you will encounter, you will not be entirely sure what the right thing to do is. What the right thing to do is may not be immediately obvious to you and to the other services with whom and with which you are working. There are dilemmas in many of these cases. How do you balance safety on the one hand, keeping people safe on the one hand, with their expressed wishes on the other, which actually might involve a significant amount of risk? And I've put on this slide not just the story of Manuela Sykes, and the Court of Protection reference that will help you to understand how a Court of Protection judge balanced safety on the one hand with risk on the other, but also a Lancashire case which raised similar issues about how do we balance a person's qualified right to private and family life with also their human right to life and right to live free of inhuman and degrading treatment. How do we balance their expressed views about happiness and their desired outcomes on the one hand with safety on the other? These two cases ultimately went to the Court of Protection, and ultimately the judge had to answer the dilemma in those two cases. But I'm sure you will recognise dilemmas in the cases that you are working with, where you have to try to reach the best decision possible, recognising that sometimes that might be the least wrong decision that you can, with partners across services, arrive at. I would encourage you to read the Court of Protection judgments in each of these cases because they illustrate the challenge and the complexity of reaching the best decision that we can when we have to balance happiness and expressed wishes of the individual on the one hand with safety, with prevention of risk and safeguarding from risk on the other. There are no easy answers in these kinds of cases. That's why I'm recommending that you read these two judgments. And then lastly, in Walsall as elsewhere, there will be adult safeguarding boards, partnership arrangements of senior leaders whose responsibility it is to make sure that adult safeguarding is effective, not just in relation to self-neglect, but also in relation to other types of abuse or neglect. How often, I wonder, do you access the website of your local safeguarding adult board and partnership? How often do you look at the safeguarding adult reviews that they have completed and the policies and the procedures that they are promoting? And then lastly, we have to recognise that your work takes place in very difficult and complex and challenging circumstances. A decade or more of financial austerity, increasing demand and increasing complexity, not least because of the ongoing COVID pandemic, and sometimes social policies and legal rules that pull against each other. And so it is important that through your representatives on safeguarding adult boards, you call out national government when you think that national government is not doing as much as it could do to provide you with a facilitative context in which you can be the best practitioners and managers possible. This is a slide that gives you further references if you want to explore more fully what we know about self-neglect. And thank you for listening, and particularly thank you for the work that you do.